The Beatles' official account of their interactions with Phil Spector centers on Spector's work on their final album, Let It Be. But what if Spector's relationship with the band started before January 1970? In order to explore the possibility that he had worked with the Beatles from the beginning, let's examine an interview that was published in Ram magazine in 1976. We will also look at another article published in the Mirror in 2008, where Spector discusses his impressions regarding the Get Back sessions, in particular the song, The Long and Winding Road. As most people are probably aware, Spector's life took a turn for the worse when, after an earlier mistrial, he was later found guilty of the 2003 murder of actress Lana Clarkson and sent to prison. While incarcerated, he died in 2021. I will elaborate on his conviction for murder at the end of the video. However, for now, let's focus on his music career as a producer, since it is this part of his life that is relevant to his relationship with the Beatles. If you're not familiar with Phil Spector, he was a highly successful American record producer and songwriter. He was best known for his innovative recording practices and entrepreneurial efforts in the 1960s. Spector developed the Wall of Sound, a production style characterized by the diffusion of tone colors and dense orchestral sound. He is considered to be one of the most influential figures in pop music history and one of the most successful producers of the 1960s. The musicians from his de facto house band, known as the Wrecking Crew, rose to industry fame through his hit records. The Wrecking Crew was a loose collective of American session musicians based in Los Angeles who played on many recordings in the 1960s and 1970s, including hundreds of top 40 hits. Although the musicians were not publicly recognized at the time, they were treated with reverence by industry insiders. Today, they are considered to be one of the most successful and prolific recording units in history. In the early 1970s, Spector produced the Beatles' Let It Be album and several solo records by John Lennon and George Harrison. By the mid-1970s, Spector had produced 18 U.S. top 10 singles for various artists. In a hard-to-find interview with Roy Carr from the May 1976 edition of Ram Music magazine, Phil Spector made some astonishing claims about his connection to the Beatles. Spector stated in the interview that his relationship with the band preceded his work on the group's Let It Be album, which was released in May 1970. According to the narrative, Spector was asked by John Lennon and George Harrison to salvage the recordings from the Get Back sessions and create a viable album. According to another version of the story, it wasn't Lennon and Harrison who brought Spector in to work on the tapes, but Alan Klein. As many Beatle fans know, Spector received some criticism for his production of the album, but John Lennon had a different opinion. When Lennon was asked about Phil's work on the album, John was quoted as saying, "He was given the shittiest load of badly recorded shit with a lousy feeling towards it ever. And he made something out of it. He did a great job." In the 1976 Ram interview, Spector claimed that the song, The Long and Winding Road, was not just a re-edit of existing recorded tracks. In order to finish the song, he mentioned that several tracks needed to be redone. In the 2008 Mirror article, Spector criticizes the song. Upon hearing it for the first time, he stated that the recording was terrible. Spector explains that John Lennon was playing bass on it with all the wrong notes, and there was no snare drum on the recording, necessitating the need for Ringo to play on it. He added, "Paul was singing as if he didn't believe it. He was mocking it. John did not like the song, and that's why he played bass on it, but he didn't know the chord changes, so he was guessing. It was a farce, and I had to do everything I could to cover up the mistakes." Spector said producing the album was the recording job from hell. He continued by saying, "I worked with strangers in a hostile environment, with a hostile press, and with hostile people, all of whom thought I was taking their Beatles away. It was not an enviable task. But I wanted Let It Be to be a great farewell album. I knew they were breaking up. I knew there wouldn't be a reunion, but the public did not." In the Carr interview, Roy recounts an interaction he saw personally at Gold Star Studios in Los Angeles. During the recording of Dion's new single, Let's Stick Together, Spector kept addressing studio drummer Jim Keltner over the intercom as Ringo. Phil was making vague references to how Keltner had on certain occasions saved the skin of the Beatles drummer. Carr stated that Keltner left quickly after the session. Spector explained that he left to prevent any questions from Carr or other journalists about the Ringo inferences. In addition to minimizing Ringo's role in the band, Spector also took a jab at George Harrison by claiming that he was unable to sing like John or Paul. Spector stated to Carr that he made the group what they were, and George Martin's role was that of the arranger. Phil states that he loves and appreciates the Beatles, but they are no longer the Fab Four. He affirms that they created good music, but that he was largely responsible for most of it. He stated that there was never a day, hour, or moment in the recording studio when he didn't influence the band. Spector adamantly states to Carr that he is telling the truth, and if the band were asked openly, they would agree, and if George Martin wants to take him on one-on-one, that's fine. When Roy Carr inquired directly about whether Phil Spector was involved with the Beatles before Let It Be, Spector responds by saying yes, he was, and confirmed that he was involved in iconic albums such as Rubber Soul, Sgt. Pepper, and the White Album. He continues by stating that when he was given the task of creating 4 stars, referring to the Beatles, he accomplished it. Spector is then asked by Carr why he was not given credit for his work on the albums. Phil responds by saying, "Who cares whose name goes on the label as the producer?" stating that he only cared about what he was doing and that he was proud of it. Carr continues to probe by saying that, aside from Let It Be, Spector's name has never been linked to the Beatles in a professional capacity. It's always been George Martin. Spector replies by saying, "For the record, let's keep it that way. We certainly don't want to change the record or shatter illusions." Carr continues with his questioning, thinking Spector might be playing one of his games, and that Let It Be was his first and only Beatles project. Maybe Spector is irked because he didn't get the opportunity to work with the greatest band of all time until it was too late. Spector responds by asking Carr, "When did the Beatles first come to America?" Carr says February 7th, 1964. Spector then asks, "And I was on the same plane as them, right?" Carr responds by saying, "Right." Spector then says to Carr, "Oh gee, now you're suddenly getting very clever. You're beginning to realize the answer to your own questions." When Carr asked why there was so much secrecy, Spector explained that the right people didn't ask the right questions. According to the article, Spector was tasked with renegotiating an early recording contract for the Rolling Stones with Decca. He had intended to become the record producer for the Stones and have their American releases on his label, but Decca rejected the deal because they had their own London label for the band's American releases. Hence, the Stones lost Spector as their producer. Spector explains that the rivalry between the Stones and Beatles was not just a publicity stunt to maximize press coverage. He suggests that the Stones were envious of his collaboration with their rivals. Spector explains that his story about his involvement with the Beatles is true, and he doesn't bullshit because he doesn't have to. He adds that maybe someday we'll hear the same thing from the Beatles themselves. Carr explains that at this point, Spector refused to say anything else on the subject except to recommend re-listening to the White Album and checking out the editing on Abbey Road. On February 3rd, 2003, Spector shot and killed actress Lana Clarkson while she was in his mansion in Alhambra, California. Spector's murder trial began on March 19th, 2007, and ended on September 26th because of a hung jury. Spector's retrial for murder in the second degree commenced on October 20th, 2008. On March 26th, 2009, the case was brought to the jury, and after 18 days, on April 13th, the jury handed down a guilty verdict. He was immediately taken into custody and, on May 29th, 2009, was sentenced to 19 years to life in the California state prison system. Various attempts to appeal were unsuccessful. While in prison, he experienced health complications and passed away in a hospital on January 16th at the age of 81. Phil Spector was definitely a contradiction to say the least. On the one hand, he was a highly successful producer and savvy businessman. The Wrecking Crew, his studio band, became legendary, and he had at least one collaboration with the Beatles. On the other hand, he was known for his strange and eccentric behavior, and in the end, he was convicted of murder. What are your thoughts? Is his story believable or a tall tale fabricated by Phil Spector? Please share your thoughts in the comment section. Thank you for listening.